Привет, Vladimir!
Hello, Vladimir. So, appears that Russian economy is doing better and better. And I guess to make it even more remarkably better, they have just decided to increase their percent rate. The central bank just had risen it by another percent. So, can you tell us more about fantastic records of Vladimir Putin with his fantastical Russian economy? Yes, hi, Michael. Yeah, the rate is not exactly the highest yet, but I think Russia is on a fourth or fifth place by the height of the rate of the refinancing. So central bank in Russia had risen it from 18% to 19%. First of all, it went against the prognostication. Previous times, the banks and analysts were actually guessing more or less what is going to happen, but here everybody were sort of lulled with what we were discussing during the last few weeks about a relatively low August inflation, that perhaps inflation in Russia is now low and slowed down. Perhaps central bank will take pity on everybody in Russia and maybe they won't be increasing it further, but they increased it to 19 and they already stated that they will increase it to 20 in October. Their next meeting is on the 25th of October, and Nabiullina, I don't think she was so harsh in her statements before, that if all these shenanigans with the high inflationary background will not stop, we will increase the rate. She's not saying they will be thinking, analyzing, or reviewing. She's basically saying that just await the next rise on the October meeting. And here's the chart for you with the rate of 19. To those who sing asanas to Russian economy, how wonderful it is, it got back practically to the March of 22, when I would remind our listeners that to quiet the panic on the markets, central bank, related to the war, central bank established a forbidding rate of 20, and 2.5 years after figuring out that, look, Russian economy is not so bad, it's back to the original point. And the markets have reacted to this relatively sad as well. Overall, the moods in Russia are saying that there's no exit out of this. Much harsher than a July press conference. This one, where she was making a press statement, she was much harder on everything. She was basically saying that inflationary pressure is not weakening. The price growth permeates all kinds of goods. And if you remember our discussion during the last several weeks, that inflationary background and processes were slowing down in August. But Nabiullina did mention that they were expecting some of the prices to drop down, and it did not happen. So August inflation near zero, therefore, appears to them as a bad sign, because they're actually expecting it to go into negative. But other things are also not being resolved that are at the source, at the core of this inflationary pressure. By the way, Russian Stat published additional information on Wednesday, and it did not help to cool anything down, because inflation is back to 0.09, rather relatively high values for the week. And that pause that we saw during the previous few weeks, that was just a temporary issue. As I said, September is upon us and it's off to the races again. And basic things. Deficiency in production capacity hasn't disappeared. Cadre problems, personnel issues is only becoming worse. And Nabiullina is talking about that. It's very interesting. We'll give you a video snippet from her statement, but I think it's the first time that she is talking about these problems in that scale that create that additional inflationary pressure, the difficulties with international payments. That topic was threaded like a red line through her statements. And also she is talking about difficult situation on the world natural resources markets. We will get back to that. You see that the oil continues to go down. It's in decline. Right, actually surprising, Vlad. It's, I don't know if there are any big stories behind it. Maybe you can elaborate more and explain us what's going on. Oh yeah, I will, Michael. And there are some interesting stories behind that situation. We'll get back to that in a minute. But the whole complex, everything that she is outlining in her speech, the drop on the oil prices, the weakening of the ruble, it's also pro-inflationary factor. So poor Elvira Nabiullina is being attacked by all these pro-inflationary wolves from all sides, and she is shooting back at them with a high percent rate. And frankly, I don't know what do they want to achieve with this. So look, Michael, you will listen to her, and our viewers and listeners will take a listen. You can hear her talking about the harshest of the issues they're facing. No cadre, no production capacity. If you invest more in the production takes time to ramp up. Inflationary pressures, prices drops, market prices drops for resources, which are important for Russia. So a question, how among all these scary problems will raising the rate from 18 to 19% help her? Right? This is a funny question. They've been holding that rate at 16. In the last 2 months, they have increased it to 18, and it's still not helping. Now we have 19% in the studio, and I guess now everything will change. Is that what is expected of it? Right. Horrible temporary blocking rate at the beginning of the war at 20%, and our small, not affecting anything, tiny rate of 19%, right? Just to compare the two. I frankly think, Michael, they wanted to increase it to 20, but they have not done it on the same psychological reason that this is a historical maximum that is being mentioned. That is still people remembering about the first weeks of this war. So let's listen to Nabiullina, and then I'll give you a bit more commentary. Today, we made a decision to increase the rate to 19% per annum. During the last months, credit conditions were worsening. Russian credit system has somewhat slowed down due to our continuous increase of the percent rate. However, inflationary pressure is not weakening. Inflation is higher than what is needed to return to the normal prices in the next year. Today's decision will send an impulse to perhaps deflate some processes from our monetary policy side. We understand that the next meeting will have to discuss this rate again, and I'll discuss some of the reasons behind our decision. First is inflation. Price pressure remains high due to both stable and volatile components. Most of the stable components of pricing are still within the 6 to 8% inflation, unacceptably high rates for us. For example, vegetables is another group, and fruit, they have not went down in price much this summer. Also, several important for people marker goods, such as gasoline and milk products, have also been increasing. That also feeds up inflationary expectations. We also suspect that July project on inflation to hit 6.5%, maybe 8% this year will likely be exceeded this year. Why? Because, first of all, to inflationary expectations. Population in our country sees that on the rise for the fourth month, and we can see these expectations get reflection in the retail. Professional analysts had pushed back the results of taming inflation to our desired numbers over to 2026. And these high expectations make it much more difficult to get anti-inflationary trend developed. We also think that the economic demand is not balanced. Demand is not balanced with supply. High inflation is the sure indicator of that. So we can look at with more details at situation in our economy. What is limiting supply and what is heating up demand? On the supply side, the key component to grow production is job market. Unemployment is at the historic minimum again, and according to the data, the companies that suffer from lack of personnel is significant high. Also, problems with logistics and international payments, they add to that bucket. In September, the indicator of business climate for the first time in this year went into the negative. This is one of the signs of slowdown economic activities. The growth of international economy is also slowing down, which matches our prognostication too. This is happening for the most part due to the industrial production, while the services feel themselves pretty okay. Overall, the international demand becomes, the global demand becomes less energy dense, so that causes the price in the energy market to go down in the unfavorable direction for us. For Russia, these trends on the oil market are pro-inflationary. The lowering of prices for the major part of Russian goods led to lowering down some of the exports, but due to imports increasing, the balance of foreign trade overall went down. The problems with international payments still permeate our international actors, which also slows down the growth potential for these companies in the situation of high internal demand. Now, here are the risks for the basic prognosis as we see it. Internal risks are working at capacity and having low personnel resource. In this situation, any additional stimulation of demand will only lead to increase in price without increase in output and production. Plus, there are still risks from the inflationary expectations that may hang for quite a while on the high level. Finally, there is a risk for potential worsening of geopolitical pressure on Russia, also slowdown of more stronger economies in the world that can lead to lower demand for energy goods, which also will affect Russian economy. As for the international payments, here during the last few months, we are facing a complication, a difficult situation with them that leads to increase of transaction expenses, and along with other things, this is a pro-inflationary factor. We are not commenting the measures that are being taken to not disclose all secrets that we have. But we've looked at 3 different options at our meeting to keep the rate, to increase the rate to 19%, and to increase the rate to 20%. Most attention was paid to the increase to 19 or 20%, especially after we received statistics on the current inflation. All right, so several points here that I wanted to sum up her speech with. So first of all, look at the big picture. Nabiullina is mentioning a lot of very systemic factors that are not going anywhere, that are pressing the inflation in Russia. The deficit of capacity, the deficit of personnel, the deficit with and issues with international payments, lowering down prices for oil, and there are no rescue ray of sunshines anywhere that could have helped, that production will develop somehow and catch up with demand, that material and energy resource prices will start going up in the market. Nothing like that. And of course, the problem with personnel is going to stay there for a while, so no hopes there. So in this situation, what do they see behind them raising the rate to 19%? They're saying we're sending a signal. A signal to whom? You know, there is such a laboratory for research of extraterrestrial civilizations. They have a huge transmission setup, and they've been sending signals for decades to the outer space, but yet haven't drawn attention of anyone. Who's going to be listening to these signals of theirs? All these pro-inflationary factors that she's mentioning, they're independent from her microscopic raise of the rate. And to make it worse, remember we quoted the conversation with journalists back in July when they're saying that why are we not increasing the rate drastically? Why are you doing it slow? Why are you slow walking? Why don't we increase it to 20% or even about, higher? And Nabiullina 2 months ago was saying that no, we cannot increase it beyond 18 because such a shock increase will lead to nothing and it will only cool down the economy, but will not stop the inflation. Well, attention. They have waited for about a month and a half and decided that they need to do it. They need to go into the shock therapy. Here's another clip from her July statements. We cannot increase the rate above 20% and higher to achieve our goals faster. Why cannot we do it? Because such an increase, as they say, the medal has 2 sides. Yes, we can pause the inflation and maybe even provoke some deflation by the high rate. But the result will be not going the economy back to the balanced growth, but overall excessive cool down of demand with heightened volatility in all parameters, in percent rates, in production, in employment and in serious deviations and not meeting the goals at the end. And high volatility has negative consequences for economic development overall, so we are trying to stay away. We don't have any need for these drastic, shocking measures. So one can see that central bank is wavering here. It's jumping from one position to another. Just a couple months ago, they were saying that such a drastic increase will slow down the economy and it will lead to poor scenarios. And now they are walking this walk. That means that all the bad scenarios have already come true. And remember, Michael, what was happening the first half a year, early on in spring specifically. She's saying that she saw some deflationary processes that are already happening and they're almost upon us. Now that part of her speech is completely gone. All her words are to the opposite. What does it tell us about? Again, new big hello to all the experts who are telling us about her great professionalism. You see how they're jumping with the interval of a few weeks and changing their points of view, their approaches, and they just don't know what to do with the whole situation. What is also important is that they started to acknowledge that sanctionary pressure is a key factor here that works for all that. So what will follow? Credits will become inaccessible. Nabiullina in her speech is saying that companies do have some growth, but as we mentioned, it's concentrated in a dozen of sectors: oil, banks, chemical production, and those who are exporting goods specifically. Overall economy is facing much less profits and actually in decline. On the rates like this, nobody can take credit. That means the economy will slow down, and it already has started. She said that in September, indicators of a business climate, we'll get back to that, showed the worst number over the recent period. And as we see, the inflationary process is not being stopped. It's just the economy that is getting slowed down. That's funny. And you and I here in YouTube, we're not in the board of directors of Central Bank, but we've been discussing that a few months ago, and that was our conclusion. Over there, they have supposedly high professionals with a lot of awards and special people who have decades of experience, right? Who are coming to the same conclusions empirically as we foretold them a few months ago. Oh yeah, and some of the Western publications also sing asanas to Putin's economic team, right? So what's funny, you may actually want to listen to that recent statements by Nabiullina, see what you think about it yourself. It lasts about an hour and 12, but it is interesting. If before she was saying that, you know, there are some bright spots here and there, we're going in the right direction, it's slow, but we'll get there. This message that was in this discussion, it's all gloom. It's all doom and gloom, nothing bright on the horizon. Inflationary processes are making things work. So everything they were talking about in this conference, every question that is being asked by journalists, the answer is everything is slowing down. Everything is slowing down and the parameters are not met. Companies monitoring publication is also released in September, and it says that overall the business climate fell by about 20 points, from 6 and something to 5 and something points. And overall, Russia has rolled back to the values of about 22. So it fell back 2 years. And looking at the prognostication, situation likely will continue getting worse. So next moment we're expecting is October 25th. If you want to get more doom and gloom from Nabiullina, unless she gets fired by that time and Putin finds a new person. I don't know if he'll put Shoigu or somebody to run Central Bank, some unorthodox move. But I think October will be even gloomier than today. So that's their situation. They failed to do anything productive. Sanctions do work. Also, energy prices going down also affects their situation, and they cannot raise and change the tide. And everything they invest in the economy only turns back on them as additional unsupported monetary investments. So, and she's outlining that herself. I actually saw a statement by Budanov on the Ukrainian side, the head of the Intel, It's a separate question how much he understands about Russian economy, but he did say an interesting thing, that all economic factors considered, Putin, by the middle of 25, will have to face a moment of truth where he would understand that he cannot continue in the current pace. And I would agree with him on this. Everything that we see economically indicates that we're going to some moment in the future months where the depletion of resources will become obvious. Another important point about oil that I wanted to bring up. First of all, oil is slightly above 70 for Brent, and Urals is at 60 something. By the way, there were some news that Urals, according to Argus, actually fell down even below the $60 mark per barrel. This is a new, I guess, the first time since last year, because after the last low, they reached some relatively higher numbers, but they're back at it. And an important article on Bloomberg that I've seen, and I recommend you guys look it up, that for the first time since 2011, hedge funds, and hedge funds are those investment funds that are much less regulated, that only allow professional investors to play certain risks to make more money than the average market profitability. So hedge funds, for the first time, are betting to serious lowering of the oil prices in the next periods. So they started to withdraw money from oil, and they're prognosticating that long-term the price of oil is going down. What is affecting it? Several factors. First, you can see that, and by the way, China, absolute conclusion was made that they cannot restart their economy. The tempo of growth of Chinese economy remain low. Earlier, they had some hopes that it's almost on the brink, it's going to work. Now they basically underline saying, no, it's not working. And we showed that chart to you earlier. We can bring it to the map again, to the screen again. In China, new energy vehicles, electric vehicles, are taking over combustion engine vehicles, and electrification of transport is actually on the rise in China. That indicates that their demand for oil is not going to increase with economic growth. They're basically switching to the electric vehicles and the industrial size. And the next moment, the OPEC countries are trying to maintain somewhat good face when their game is lousy, and they're saying that they likely will continue with quotas and stuff, but one can tell that there's a lot of inner pressure between the participants who are saying that if the price went down, what's the point for us to keep the production low? Let's just let it all go and try to pump more to compensate for the loss in profits. This is a situation similar to the beginning of the 20s, when nobody believes that on the backdrop of low prices, OPEC will be able to control its participants from just spitting on everything and going for increase in production. You and I have been talking about these economic things for over 2 years now, Michael, and I continue to say here that I do not see $100 per barrel oil, that there is a bunch of reasons why not. It likely will continue to try to get there, but then after a while it will start falling. And I think we are at this moment. And now there are discussions that Brent may actually be at 60 or even below that. Don't know if we'll see that in the immediate future, but what we see now is that Putin will not get enough money from his oil sales. And Nabiullina is also outlining that in her speech, that it's a serious negative factor in the situation. So they're at the end of the game. The sanctions are working, the economy is not rising up, is not restarting. All the money are being spent to fight inflation, and the oil is now dropping its value. So for Putin, it is some sort of a moment of truth, and I am in agreement with Kirill Budanov. A phrase which nobody probably expected to hear from Vladimir Milov in the economic review, right? All right, in this context, you're saying that the increase of rate doesn't really work, that the oil continues to drop. However, the intensity of their fighting on the front just gives them maybe a half a year window, after which they need to start changing whatever and however they do things. Now, I have a few questions related. Do you think they will still increase the funding of Russian army regardless? And the second, what can they do? Right, I don't want to, and by the way, we're asking this question not to tell them how they can survive, but to basically outline what are they trying to circumnavigate and how can that be used. So from looking at what can they do to stabilize their situation, do they have any options? So answering your question, Michael, yes, I think they will increase the expenses for Russian army. By the way, to remind our viewers, we still have a betting game with Michael. We're waiting for proverbial end of September when we'll see the federal budget project for 2025. And we are betting here that at least for 2.2 trillion rubles, the Russian expenditures for military next year are going to be increased. Nabiullina here is talking with care about budget situation. She is not specifically outlining an issue there, but she is saying that budgetary policies do affect inflation, and we will be expecting the next projections of a budget for the next 3 years, and we will correlate our fiscal politics with the budget. So again, if we'll see more money being invested into the military, we probably will see higher rates from Nabiullina. But as for your question, what can they do? This is a dead-end story. The harshness of fiscal policies is at the level where the economy starts to physically cool down. This is what's supported by the central bank data. If they continue to be just as hard on the policies, it will hit upon everything, on the production, on the profits, and of course on the taxes. And that means that Putin's government will be able to gather much less taxes from industries. On the other hand, you can also see, it's not even me, you can see it yourself, that they are running out of money. They don't have enough money for supply, they don't have enough money for payments, military production continues to request more and more money. So they have a simple choice really. First is to stop the war. Just first, step number one, decide we stop it. And second, to try to look for additional monetary components anywhere to plug these holes somehow. Now, looking at Putin, I do not see any desire in him to stop this war, so he will likely continue to scrape his coffers and continue to increase the taxes. Technically, he still has this ability, and the only issue is that it is the same as the hard fiscal policies of central bank. It turns and fires back at him with cool down of economy because people will be investing less. So they have some short-term options, but they all will have a result of cooling down of the economic activities and decrease of growth and stagnation. Why Nabiullina is talking about stagflation. Do you know what it is? It is when there is no growth, but the prices keep rising and the inflation is high. So what's the key factor affecting the situation is Putin's stubbornness and his vision that he, one way or another, willy-nilly will find a way to wiggle his room in this war. And that reminds me of Gorbachev in 1980s, when people saw that there is no resource to continue in the old fashion and Russia needs to go, Soviet Union needs to go for radical economic reforms. But Gorbachev has chosen to still try to wiggle a bit, and he had an opportunity to borrow money on the West. Now Putin does not have this way, so he'll have to create some money within. But even that led Gorbachev to a very critical point where everything collapsed. So if you imagine that now we are in some economically 1989, and back then there were a lot of economists who were saying that no, Russia, Soviet Union still has a lot of resources, the crash is not happening, the country can continue going for decades. A Balkans economic program had, 20 years horizon published at that time, but suddenly, after a few events, that situation started spiraling down, and just in 2 years, Russia found itself at 1991, when everything collapsed. So if Putin will continue playing that same line and continues to juice all juices from his economy, that will lead, in my opinion, to a much faster downward spiral. And more conversation, as you see, are happening around 2025, becoming a pivotal moment. And a lot of dead ends for resource opportunities and general opportunities to take for Putin are going to happen in the year to come. So what's interesting, this month we'll find out what's happening with the budget for next year. It's just a matter of 2 weeks, the project of a budget for the next year. And second is Central Bank meeting on the 25th of October, when we'll probably see new statements that everything did not get better, and we'll continue observing that. What else did I want to talk about today? Gasoline. Nabiullina did mention it, that the fact that gasoline prices in Russia are going up, it is not helping them to fight the inflation. When, for example, there is some prices dropping for fruit and vegetables, gasoline is still going on the rise. So what deserves to be said in this regard is that the growth of gasoline prices continues to increase. Last week they had 0.2%, now it's at almost 0.4%. And 98 had grown for about 10 rubles since the last year, since December. And 98 gasoline indeed is reflecting the hits of Ukraine on the high-level refineries. And since August, it had grown for a ruble and a half and almost 9 rubles since the beginning of this year. 95 gasoline is not growing as rapidly, but they are artificially held down with the agreements on with the government in Russia. And OT Consult, an analytic company, is writing that during 6 weeks, the marginal income for 95 for the retailers was negative 1.5% per liter. So they're holding prices due to agreements with the government. And frankly, the gas stations, gas pumps are suffering losses, and they're getting additional funds from the government to accommodate for that. And that's how they're holding the prices. If that was not happening, the growth, the notable growth, would be happening on that gasoline as well. And on the other hand, modern vehicles, they do require high-octane gasoline, so that already is being felt by Russian populace, over about 10% since the beginning of the year. Going back to the budget, what else is worth noting is that, speaking of investments or any other possible windows for economic growth there, I wanted to show a special picture, the break apart by the investments in different industries. All our military production is at the first. Computers, electronic, and optics are growing by tenth of dozens percent, and other transport, military equipment is at 48%. Overall investments is 13%. So you can see how military is on the rise, military investments. When they're saying that investments in the economy are growing, you need to understand that these are budgetary additional downpours into the military production. And Vlad, I don't know why do they call budgetary investments into the military system as investment, because formally maybe it is an investment from the point of view of the factory, but if you're talking about the scale of the country, investment implies that there is something happening out of it, and it's supposed to be somewhat separated from the budget, because if you take your budget and spend into the military production, you just take 100 rubles from the right pocket and invest it into the left pocket? It's not working like that, right? Well, Michael, investments are calculated with a standard accounting tool. So if you spend money to build a capacity and build a new facility, bring new equipment, it doesn't care what is it spent for, right? Is it military production or is it some consumer goods? Right. Well, I'm also outlining the difference in investments. There could be foreign investments or, commercial investments, and there is federal investments. Federal, it's really not an investment. Well, right, we can probably speak about them in the effectivity frame, because when it is market investments, then the rubles are being chased to see how effective was the return rate, or was it a good investment, was it not? When it's a government investment like we're observing here, this is literally not about the profitability. It's literally taking money from one pocket and putting to another. When it's all happening in the closed government cycle, remember how Makarov was talking in the St. Petersburg Forum, that the first they give money to produce, then they give money to the buyer to purchase it, then we give money for them to put it to the warehouse so they can hold it, and then we give them money to recycle the goods when they perished or not used. So, no joking. On paper, it is investment, but and that's what they say their investments are growing. That's the chart that was explaining the paradox that we hear that the growth in Russian economy continues, but there's nothing happening on the consumer side. Well, because they're just burying their funds. What else is happening there? Minister of Finance, again, tries to raise some money. It's slightly lower than 16% profitability, 15.98. and they gave these bonds to the market for about half of the demand. The demand is about at 78, they gave at 30 billion. And RGBA, Russian government bond index, was somewhat fluctuating, but eventually dropped down to the historic minimums. So Ministry of Finance has no perspective to borrow cheap. So perhaps next week it will have to go and offer higher than 16% profitability on their papers. Another interesting moment happening with China is that they continue to have the crisis of international payments, and it is on such a high level. Remember when in spring, when it just started, there were conversations that we will find a way to negotiate that with China, we'll find some ways around it. Then Putin went to China, then Chinese prime minister came to Moscow, they signed some documents. Now going back to the statement of Nabiullina, and she's saying that the problems are only exacerbating. So they have not found any solution during these times. And the news from Chinese banks continue to arrive that they continue to make it more difficult to transfer payments between them and Russia. For example, for Chinese suppliers, they're actually installing some territorial limitations so that they cannot open accounts in the provinces where they do not have economic representation. So what's happening? The most production in China is on the southeast, Shanghai, Guangzhou, where most of the economy is. That's where most of the banks and companies do work who refuse to work with Russia. Russian side starts to work with northern regional banks in Heilongjiang and Inner Mongolia, the border with Russia, and try to conduct these transactions through those banks. And Chinese banks are coming and saying that, no, we're not going to work with companies who open fictitious accounts in the provinces where they do not have economic activity. And it is done just to circumvent the sanctions. Another funny piece of news is that Chinese banks started to cancel payments when they see Russian names in the payment documents. So we are awaiting for Russian side to start renaming their representatives working with China in Chinese pseudonyms. And of course, Kazakhstan. Remember, last time we talked about Kyrgyzstan. Now we can talk about Kazakhstan. Foreign Trade Bank of Russia opened Kazakhstan branch there, but local banks ceased to work with it because of the threats of the secondary sanctions from the West. So that hammer of secondary sanctions does work. And once again, Elvira Nabiullina acknowledged, I think for the first time in such a big scale, how big of a problem that payment problem is. And last news that I wanted to wrap up our stream today, another knife in the back from China. Chinese government told their automobile producers to stop opening integration production facilities in Russia. Remember, Russia had some hopes that Chinese manufacturers will come and will be building automobile factories there and creating employment and jobs in Russia. And Chinese government sending a very strong signal that this should not be done. And the reason is very simple. China has poor economic data. Their economy is in decline. And Chinese are telling their companies, we don't want you to export jobs outside the country. And they're talking not only about Russia, they're talking about other countries as well. But they're basically refocusing themselves to build factories and create jobs within China to support some sort of economic growth. And that's what altogether global partnership with China that Putin and Russian television were drawing for the people outside in the world, that collapses as the house of cards. Now China cannot even build factories in Russia. Nobody really was going to. There were maybe one or two cases when they had some projects, mostly the ones that started before the beginning of this full-scale invasion. And in the core, it means that the topic of large-scale Chinese investments in Russia is closed. You do not need to monitor that. That's done with. That kills all hopes for Russian industrial import replacement from the West with maybe Asian sources. And this is difficult cul-de-sac where I don't see how Putin can sneak out from. It's a trap where he put himself into. And the slow stifling is slow. Unfortunately, it's not as fast as we all wanted it to be, but the signs are significant and the problems are biting. And as the Spleen music group was singing, There is no exit, no way out. I agree with you on this, Vlad. I don't see an exit either. Many economists also reviewing that saying, yeah, there is nothing. But we faced situations in this war when we were talking that Russia was facing some crisis and they still figured out how to solve them. But again, it was mostly throwing these problems into a long-term bucket from a short-term bucket. So they were exchanging immediate capability to simulate normal life to perhaps worsen their long-term problems. I don't know, maybe they will concoct something unusual and unexpected. Market is a very strong instrument, and as you like saying, it's still working in Russia, partially. All true, Michael, and Putin is very stubborn. He has a quarter of a century of experience behind his shoulders, where he found ways out in different situations, and he will continue trying to wiggle himself out of this. Speaking of the market, an interesting point here is that private enterprise is indeed somewhat semi-alive in Russia, and it continues to look for ways out and exits. But this all reminds me, you can look it up in YouTube, mongoose and the cobra. And the snake, the cobra, always tries to bite the mongoose, and maybe sometimes even win. But overall, 80% plus of these battles end with the victory of a mongoose. You just need to hold the snake and continue hitting it in the weak points, and continue with the pressure on Putin. So if you look at the year, what's happening from the beginning, the year is not bad overall. The West has figured a way with sanctions, and Putin is running out of resources, and all these issues that they postponed from the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they started cropping up. They started, the dam is breaking apart. And Nabiullina is talking about exactly that in her press conference on Friday. Of course, Putin still has a lot of options to find possible one or two ways out temporarily, but overall the growth of pressure, the growth of these negative signs for him are good. And that should inspire us. That should actually inspire us to continue looking for more ways to sanction, for more ways to help Ukraine, and that's what we're trying to find here in our economic streams. I love your attitude, Vlad. See you guys next week. Thank you all for watching us. Till we meet again. Goodbye. Goodbye, everybody. See you later.